Everyone, sorry for the incredibly loose setup today, but girlfriend is working from home today and she banditized my workspace. So now I'm in the bedroom just kind of hanging out and recording here. So I know that a while ago I said I wasn't going to play any more whip decks, but that was 3 weeks ago. I think that constitutes as a while. And a couple other things. The whip decks were getting kind of stagnant, and then abzan aggro popped up, and that was a pretty bad matchup. So it was like, do you really want to watch a whip deck get crushed over and over again? Probably not. But this deck is, I would say, like Sidisi whip is a full whip deck. Abzan whip is probably like a half whip deck, and this deck is maybe like a quarter of a whip deck. So it's not even really a whip deck. But this deck is my attempt to actually make those bad matchups pretty good, and I've been working on this for the last couple weeks, and I finally got it to a spot where I thought it was pretty good. So now I'm going to play with another whip deck, and I hope that's okay with you guys. But I played in a live PTQ last weekend, ended up making the top 8, but can't play in the Pro Tour because of my stipulation from working for Wizards. So I just want to play to, play Magic and just have fun, hang out with people. And I ended up conceding to a friend of mine in top 8 because I could not play in the Pro Tour. But unfortunately, he did not win the tournament. But I went 6-1 in the Swiss, and then with the concession, my record overall was still pretty good. And this deck basically did what I wanted it to do. So I think that's a success. And now Favorite Forge is coming out. Presumably, a bunch of things are going to change and whatnot. So if the decks stay relatively the same, I think this deck is going to be pretty good. Or if you have like a tournament this weekend, or this week rather, like an FNM or something, I think this deck would be a pretty good choice. So the issue with the abzan aggro matchup is that they get on the board faster than you. They ignore a lot of your removal and a lot of your creatures, because things like Fleecemane Lion, Rakshasa Death Dealer, they attack through Courser of Crufix pretty well. Even Siege Rhino is not that big of a deal for them because they have things like Abzan Charm to either just remove it outright or put counters on their guys and stuff. So it's really hard to actually just stabilize against them. And in order to make that a little bit better, I needed some more creatures, and I felt like those were basically the best brick walls. Like, yeah, I could play a bunch of like Bile Blights and try and kill their little stuff and everything, but in the big picture type of thing, like I don't think that's going to work out very often. So I think your best bet is to actually play more creatures and try and just stall out the ground a little bit. Maybe try and keep them off of Raid for Wingmate Rock, because that's probably their best card against you. And eventually just like run them out of removal or have some big way to get ahead. So previously against decks like that was Hornet Queen, and that was a really good trump, because even if they did play something like Wingmate Rock, you suddenly have 5 Death Touch things that are basically just removal spells that they have to deal with on an individual basis. But since abzan aggro started main decking a bunch of Bile Blights, that's not as reliable. So I have no Hornet Queens. I have a bunch of smaller creatures. So I have a couple Anafenzas, which also double as hate for mirror type matches. I have a couple Reaper of the Wilds, which we should probably talk about a little bit, because this card, not the best, right? It's like people played it a little bit, but overall it was, I think, just a touch too low on the power level scale, despite having a bunch of sweet abilities and relatively good stats. But I think Reaper is actually the card that you want against abzan aggro, just because it's really hard for them to attack through, because even if they pump their guy, you can just give your guy Death Touch. If they try and kill your guy, and you set it up so that you play this with mana open, you can always just give it hexproof. And in the mirror type matches where there's a lot of trading going on, you just get to scry a bunch and hopefully set up, you just continually set up for like an even better turn on your next turn. So the scry ability helps a lot. Death Touch is great. Hexproof is great. Being a 4/5 is great. And also a thing that I want to use to stabilize the ground was See the Unwritten. So with this, I wanted more ferocious things. So Anafenza and Reaper of the Wilds certainly help out there as well. And See the Unwritten is just this card that kind of lets you go over the top of these decks, and you don't need to hit things like Hornet Queens or Ashen Riders or whatever to make See the Unwritten good. if you hit like a Rhino and a Reaper or whatever, it's still just fine, and that's a pretty big game changer. Plus, it's putting cards in your graveyard for Whip of Erebos, and if you hit a Soul of Theros, you can either put it in play or put it in the graveyard if you're scared of it getting something like Abzan Charmed. So I basically cut Hornet Queen for Soul of Theros, cut a lot of the whip interaction for more creatures, more beaters, and I liked where I ended up. I only played Abzan aggro once in the PTQ, but I did win. It was pretty close, but I liked what my deck was doing. I thought that everything that I set out to accomplish, I did. So, other than that, this deck, like I said, is kind of like a quarter whip deck. You're not, milling yourself as hard as the Sidisi decks. You're not playing as many whips as the, other Abzan whip decks. But you have things like See the Unwritten, which are pretty nice because they go through your deck really fast. And something like Sidisi can afford to do something like play one Farika just because, in the late game, they're going to be pretty close to actually decking themselves, and then they can set up a turn where they have a Doomwake Giant in play, and then you put in a Farika and you get to kill your opponent's creatures. So either you have one or the other, and then you whip back the other piece, or you have something like Soul of Innistrad in the Sidisi deck, which just sets it all up. But this deck doesn't really have that except for See the Unwritten, and if you draw one of these, and if you draw both of them, it's pretty easy to get to that point where you can find all the stuff to set up this late game Wrath thing. Or you just put a bunch of creatures in play and have Soul of Theros, which they're going to be forced to probably chump block with all their guys and such. So I think this deck is better in the early game and better in the late game, if you can believe that. So, like I said, I liked where I ended up, and there's not much as far as like cosmetic stuff that's different than the normal Abzan decks, the Abzan whip decks. Like, I still have Wayfinder, Caryatid, Courser, Rhino. I have a bunch of removal spells. The only thing that's really a little bit different is I have some Abzan Charms main deck, and those are really good because like you don't need to have all of the same removal spell. The only caveat there is Stormbreath Dragon, where you would prefer to have something like 4 Heroes Downfalls instead of these Abzan Charms, but maybe that will be a big enough deal that I'll have to go and make that change eventually. But Abzan Charm is, like Downfall has a couple modes, right? It's kill an Ashiok or kill a thing, and Murderous Cut is generally 1 mana, and Utter End kills Whip of Erebos and some other stuff like Perilous Vault. And Abzan Charm can either kill stuff, put counters on your guys, or draw cards. So I like having a mix of these different removal spells because I don't want to draw like 2 or 3 downfalls and have them have something like a Perilous Vault, or maybe not have creatures, and it, maybe I would want to use Abzan Charm to draw cards instead. So I like having a mix, and for the most part they all do roughly the same thing. Like, they all kill a Siege Rhino, they all kill Sidisi, but Stormbreath Dragon is the one thing where I think Abzan Charm is the weakest, so if there are a lot of Stormbreaths, you can get rid of these. But for the most part, I liked what I did as far as the removal suite, and this actually came from David McDarby. He played in a PTQ with a pretty normal Abzan whip deck, and we were building him the deck out of my cards, and he was just like, I want to play some Abzan Charms main deck, and I was like, okay, I'm not sure, it feels kind of weird to me, but they ended up being really good for him, so I just took his removal suite and added it to my deck, so it ended up working out really well. I'm back down to 2 Doomwake Giants, which I have been for a while, but I'm not sure if that was in my video or not, if I only had 2, but I think you only need 2. There's not a ton of decks where you want this, and the decks that you do want it, you don't necessarily want it until later. Like against Abzan midrange, like you definitely want it to fight Elspeth, but you don't need it right away. So I like having 2, and if people do kind of what I do, where they cut on Hornet Queen, or they just stop playing Hornet Queen decks in general because they don't want to be bad against Abzan aggro, then you only need 2. So other than that, mana base is basically the same as I've been playing, except I cut a Force for a Plains. We'll scroll down here, and yeah, other than that, it's the exact same. I know people have been experimenting with cutting temples, or not temples, the citadels, for more temples, and that's certainly a change I can get behind, but the only issue there is that I don't want a bunch of white-black dual lands because I want to play Corsair Crewfix on turn 3, so in order to have all the colored mana sources that I wanted in this deck, it would require me to play more pain lands, which I don't want to do. Like, if anything, I would want to cut a pain land. But in order to get all the colors I needed to play all 4 Citadels, especially since I was adding more white with things like Soul of Theros, Anafenza, Abzan Charm. You know, like the old Abzan whip decks basically just had Rhino main deck for white cards, whereas now I have a bunch of white cards and my mana is a little sketchier, but the Citadels help out there. So I really like what I did with the sideboard. It's pretty simple. 4 Thoughtseize, 3 Glare, 3 Bile Blight, and post-board against a lot of decks, you just get to lower your mana curve significantly. And that's really nice because the games are generally a little bit grindier, but things like Abzan Aggro and White-Blue Heroic, you know, they don't give you a ton of time to set up and like do all this late game stuff. So you really want to lower your curve, you want to have a lot of interaction, and since the games tend to go longer, you want to cut Sylvan Caryatid. So I used to sideboard a land, but now I'm just bringing in a bunch of cheap spells, so I don't necessarily feel the need to do that. So other than that, I have extra copies of Pharika and Reclamation Sage, and those are basically like the best cards in the Mirror-ish matches, so you definitely want some of those. And then I have 2 Wingmate Rocks, which could potentially be main deck. I know Martin Juza played a couple main in his GP Manila deck, and this is certainly one of the best cards in the mid-range mirrors. I don't know, just didn't really want another double white card really, and felt like it would be better in the sideboard games. It doesn't interact very well with whip, so it's like fine, but like if you attack and then whip it to get a 3/4 permanently, it's like kind of stupid, you know. But post board, if they're attacking your whips, if they're playing Back to Natures and stuff, you need some actual threats, and you want things to both fly over the top of them. The life gain is pretty nice and provides 2 threats for 1 card, which is always great, and you know, also blocks their Wingmate Rocks, so pretty nice. And then I have the Soul of Innistrad, which has basically been in the 75 of all these decks, and if I'm playing See the Unwritten and I'm milling myself a bunch, I definitely want a Soul in my 75. I just didn't think that there are going to be a lot of things like blue-black control and whatnot where I would want this game won, so it's just chilling in the sideboard. But other than that, I think the deck's pretty sweet, and hopefully we can play against like some Abzan aggro, maybe another whip deck, maybe Abzan mid-range, and then, you know, something kind of aggressive like Jeskai or Mardu. I think that would be a pretty nice selection of things to play against, so we'll see what happens.